over to Felix and Gustav, and I'll advance to the next slide.
Thanks very much. I'm going to start us off. So the first substantive slide. Yeah, so just to give you a kind of overview, there are different kind of, I guess, versions of what we're doing at different places. So multi-stakeholder partnerships are basically between a number of partners. So it could be a government, the UN, a number of stakeholders, or it could just be a group of stakeholders that are trying to deliver something. And if you're addressing the SDGs, they're registered, then you can register them on the UN website. So they're working together to deliver one of the SDGs or to deliver one of the targets. That's a particular version of what we have. Voluntary initiatives are those commitments that individual organizations make, and that was prevalent for Rio +20, but it's also been prevalent in the UNFCCC process. So in the run-up to Paris, the Secretary General held a conference pushing the idea of individual commitments from companies, from local from stakeholders. And then public-private partnerships are really a contractual arrangement between a single or several public agencies. It could be the federal government, a state, or local, and usually to private sector, though there have developed now more recently with subcontracted NGOs doing specific work in those particular areas. There is an initiative that the United Nations Commission for Europe, UNECE, have taken forward, which is a set of principles for PPPs for SDGs. And they're looking at a number of those principles being enacted in any PPP process done to engage in SDG work. And so it's definitely worth looking at the UNECE website. And in May last year, all the other regional commissions signed an agreement to start similar types of processes in their area. There's a commitment under the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for a set of principles at the global level. That's not going to happen. There's no interest for member states under the Finance for Development process of developing that, but definitely the work at the regional level offers a much better way of ensuring that local or national organizations can have an influence on those sets of principles. Next slide, and I think it's Jan Gustav.
Mm-hmm. You get the next slide up.
He has got it up. Jan Gustav, it is up.
Now it is. Sorry, it's a bit slow coming from New York all the way across the Atlantic. Thank you, Felix, for that introduction. Yesterday, when we spoke about elements of the UNEA, and we focused on the program of work, and we talked about the medium-term strategy, we said we'll come back to elements of this tomorrow, and tomorrow is today. And why is this important? Because this is where implementation comes into being. If you remember this, the video we showed you yesterday where UNEP had talked about very, very eloquently about all the elements that goes into the medium-term strategy, they stopped short of saying, now we need to implement this. As we said yesterday, the medium-term strategy is the programmatic overview of what UNEP is going to be involved in for the next 4 years. And biannually, we have a program of work, and then it's up to UNEP, including the member states and the stakeholders, to implement that. There is an interesting discussion going on now, both in academic and in policy levels and among stakeholders, what are partnerships going to be? If you read the 2030 Agenda key document, which is known as 70.1 in terms of UN resolutions, every SDG has a partnership component. And everywhere you see partnership referred to in that document, it is the combined efforts of the private sector, the official authorities, government or municipal level, and the non-state stakeholders, the major groups or the NGO community, if you will. Partnerships are important, and they're going to be increasingly important if we are to believe what was said at the UN Sustainability Summit last year in 2019, following at the General Assembly opening, where they called for action now, and the youth were very, very adamant at saying, we need action now. And they called this decade the Action Decade for Sustainable Development and the 2030 Agenda. And of course, we have reminded you a number of times that the theme for UNEA 5 is strengthening action for nature to achieve the SDGs. And one way of achieving this is through partnerships. Partnerships in the UN context involving civil society is not new, but it came into being with a force, political force, around the run-up to the Johannesburg summit. Felix mentioned the voluntary partnerships, and to me, they're kind of like the pledging conference of governments. They pledge a lot of money to implement X, Y, and Z, and not all of them follow up on what they have pledged. And when non-state stakeholders go in and register voluntary partnerships, as they did immediately following Rio 20, in the outcome document called The Future We Want, the last paragraph talks about voluntary initiatives. In a matter of a year and a half, lots of NGOs, lots of non-state stakeholders, lots of even governments and municipalities registered voluntary initiatives. And like a pledging conference, not many of them have been actually fulfilled. So we'll deal with how to refine that. I've often been asked when I talk about partnership, are they old? Well, the oldest registered partnership between a government and a private company is a canal project in France, which was developed in the 1600s. And the biggest one to date is Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which involved the public, the organizations, the authorities, academia, and together they were able to create a New Deal. Now, we refer to the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg because this is where the Type 2 partnerships came out as it says, collaboration between national and sub-national governments, private sector actors, and other stakeholders who form voluntary transnational agreements in order to meet specific sustainable development goals. At the time, it was interesting to see how, with a knee-jerk reaction from many civil society participants, NGO participants, and major groups, saying that we should not be involved in implementing this is the responsibility of governments, and sort of took a distance to that. It created an interesting debate because I think also it contributed to challenging the major groups to understand that they also needed to be part of the implementation element. We'll refer to the Bali guidelines, which is one of the few real guidelines to direct what a partnership should be. But now this is coming into being, and we have a refined and more developed criteria for partnerships. And of course, as I already referred to, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio, saying that all stakeholders, including government and the private sector, were invited to make voluntary commitments that deliver concrete results. And as we wrote, by the end of the Rio conference already, over 700 voluntary commitments were announced. Now, this was reiterated, but I think with a much more focus on implementation in the 2015 document on the 2030 agenda. But I think I would challenge everyone listening to us now to look at that document and see how can we contribute concretely, but also look at the medium-term strategy and to the resolutions which will be discussed in UNEA 5 and the program of work, and participate. Over the years that we've been participating in earlier the governing councils that were a predecessor to the UNEA conferences, we have seen a lack of interest among the major groups in participating in the program of works discussions and the medium-term strategy and even the budget discussions for UNEP. Now, this is crucial if we're going to be honest to what we want to do, implement this. Can I have the next slide, please? It's coming across from the Atlantic. There we are. The third international conference on the small island developing states, which led to the Samoa pathway, which is an interesting document, which I recommend reading because it talks about, in a very operative way, how the so-called civil society, which is referred to a number of times. We would, of course, like to talk about stakeholders because, as Felix has said a number of times, if you talk about civil society, you actually do not include a number of the other parts of the major groups. And you exclude also business because business is not of civil society. And that's why we often talk about stakeholders in the context of the non-state stakeholders. But this has a very interesting concrete challenge to how partnerships could be developed and how this actually could contribute to implementing the Samoa pathway. Nearly 300 partnerships were registered to that conference. Now, I will make a little interesting comment to that partnership because in preparing that conference, the member states invoked the so-called no objection rule. And I referred to that yesterday. The no objection rule was and is no rule. It's a mechanism to actually, in my word, to really look hard and deny access for some of the NGOs they don't like. So be aware when you look at conferences you want to participate in, if that word is the participation of the non-state stakeholders or NGOs or major groups are subject to the no objection mechanism or rule, as it's often called, because that is going to be an exclusive process. And it's a bit, in my case, it's a bit counterproductive because if member states want to involve the people through organizations to implement these things, then they should also allow any bona fide NGO to be, or non-state stakeholder to be accredited. And I think that's over to you, Felix, for the next.
It is, yeah. Next slide. Just a couple of things. There are definitions of civil society that do include business. So one of the problems with using the term is it seems anyone can define it the way that they want to define it, which is why, again, we don't tend to use it. If you're interested to see which partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships are in your country, you can go to the UNDESA website, you go to the partnership section and search for the country, and it'll give you a list of all the partnerships in that country. So if you're thinking of doing something in a particular issue, see if there already is an established partnership that is doing something similar which you can engage with. Next year, there will be the World Food Systems Conference. So it's an initiative of the Secretary General, just like the one on climate was before Paris. So it's not a member state-led process, but they're expecting to have voluntary commitments, and they're expecting to have multi-stakeholder partnerships as part of the outcome from that. And so there are lessons to be learned. And Jan Gustav and I have been involved in the partnership discussion since it was initiated around the Johannesburg process in 2001. And the idea was type 1 is the policy commitments and the targets and goals, and part 2 or type 2 is a mechanism to help deliver it outside of original or already committed responsibility of governments to their ODA contribution. So it's meant to be an additional commitment. There was a review of the process done by Marianne Weisschram in 2014, and she looked at the partnerships that were established at Johannesburg, and she found that 70% of them were inactive or were useless, and that most of them were from OECD countries, which was not the objective, at least in Johannesburg. And there was little quantification of what they could achieve and very little funding that was made available. Though I think that the main reason for that was the aftermath of 9/11 and all the additional money that shifted out of ODA budgets to support humanitarian issues around the Middle East. Nitin Desai, who was the Secretary General of the WSSD, World Summit on Sustainable Development, said 1,000 flowers bloom. And Gustav and I have written a paper for the UN which argued that that was a bad idea, and that what we needed to do was much more cluster the work of the partnerships around similar objectives and aims. And so if you could have the next slide. And so at the moment, the only rules by which there are for partnerships are the ones that were passed in 2003. And again, Stakeholder Forum and then myself under a different hat have tried to get member states to update these instructions and to help partnerships a lot more in the establishment of their work, and therefore also to move to more of an implementation process. And so the present way that agreements or MSPs are meant to be put together is they're voluntary, they're transparent, they're credible, they're accountable, but they don't go further than that and give them advice on how to do that, or they haven't, shall we say. We have the next slide. So this was Jan Gustos, but I think he's disappeared. I guess his internet's gone, so I will present it. So there is no intergovernmental decision for this process that's going on, but it came out of the Samoa pathway, where they made a decision to try and have more quantification of the partnerships, and that the partnerships, if they were going to be registered for the Samoa pathway, they had to be specific, measurable, achievable, resource-based, and time-based deliverables. So UNDESA has expanded that approach, which is known as the SMART approach, to the 2030 partnerships. Now, they have no intergovernmental decision for doing that, so governments could at one point actually complain that that is the case. And then that's transformed into a set of instructions when you register the partnership. The other thing to think about is that the original, I think it's still the database that you have on the UN website is a mixture of the leftover partnerships from Johannesburg, which were then just brought into the database that we have for partnerships for the 2030 agenda, the voluntary initiatives for Rio Plus 20, and the partnerships that have been engaged for the 2030 agenda. And again, part of that reason for that is that they couldn't not do that because of there was no intergovernmental decision to change that, which means that you're mixing, in a sense, things that are not the same together. So voluntary initiatives are not the same. Voluntary initiative, I'm doing your slides, Jan Gustaf. Voluntary initiatives are not the same as MSPs. If we could move to the next slide. No, you're back in a few slides, so I'll carry on and you get back on.
Go on. My system crashed. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. We're well prepared for that kind of thing. So we're just looking at three of the different initiatives that are partnerships. Those that are working on vaccine and immunization, the Global Alliance has all the foundations, has the governments, has the UN agencies, WHO, UNICEF. It has the stakeholders in a combined platform and is doing extremely well in the context of delivering vaccine. The second example, which is on the polio eradication initiative, again, it's a platform of all of those. And one of the aims in both of these is the strengthening of the health departments or health systems in the countries that these are being active in. But they brought together, again, all of the initiatives that are engaged in that kind of approach. And so it strengthens it by its nature. The REAP initiative was partly because we couldn't get we were meant to get an additional Millennium Development Goal on energy out of WSSD, but because of the Americans, that wasn't possible. And so the REAP partnership was born, which had an initial target of 5% of primary energy use from renewables by 2010, which had actually been achieved and doubled by 2009. There was 13.1% of renewables, and I think it's 19% now. So that's a great example of a partnership coming together, lots of governments, lots of stakeholders to actually take forward something where the governments couldn't work together. Next slide. Yeah, the fourth one is an interesting one because it's a Secretary General initiative. So whereas there have been advancements where stakeholders have got together, the Secretary General has in a number of areas decided that there isn't a body that's doing that kind of work together and has initiated. Another one would be Sustainable Energy for All, set up again, both of these by Ban Ki-moon. Sustainable Energy for All wasn't something that the new Secretary General wanted to take up, so it was floated out as an NGO. I think it's based in Austria now, but its head is paid by the UN. It's a UN staff person, so it's a kind of hybrid organization. But the Every Woman and Every Child, one of the good things about that is that they've had outside, it was either PwC or one of the consultancies out there come in and look at seriously about what their delivery is against what they had said they would do. And it would I'd have to say that in the first report, and I haven't seen the more recent one, they hadn't delivered as much as they had done, as they had said they would do. But that created a conversation in the organization, which will hopefully make sure that they do hit their targets in the future. That kind of review, independent review, is part of being able to look to see whether these partnerships are delivering things or whether they're not delivering things. And we don't have that kind of adjudication. We do have a traffic light system now as well on the partnerships. And so if you don't report, you're meant to report. If you don't report, after a year, I think you get an orange. After 2 years, you get a red warning. After 3 years, you're kicked off. We're about to lose between 60 and 70% of the partnerships that have been registered to deliver the SDGs because people are not reporting. And so there's a whole conversation that will be very critical in the next 18 months about the system that goes around that. Again, something that Jan Gustav and I highlighted back in 2014, and we raised it over and over again, the need to have a proper process. And what we pushed for was this idea of clustering around high-level champion partnerships that you could properly monitor and you could start to see quantifications. Next slide. So there are three kinds of partnerships. And so it's not all about delivering the target, though that's very important. And so you have people who are delivering access to water or building basic sanitation, and you can quantify that. And that is very important. It's like Gavi. It's very, very focused at what it's doing, and we need to have those. But there are other ones that are, in a sense, the building blocks to be able to do that. And so one of them is sharing knowledge, a system by which you share the best knowledge you have. And I've used Global Water Partnership, though they do actually also do projects as well. But as a knowledge base, I think it's an interesting use. Setting standards for particular groups. I've used the CEO Alliance for water stewardship, but you could have used the principles for responsible investment, the principles for responsible banking. Those are ways of setting standards by which then you can build and actually hit targets. And so if you look at the company areas, then the Global Compact has a process on their website where companies can start to sign up to deliver against the different SDGs and the different targets. And so those fit into supporting once you've got a set of principles to guide you. Next slide. One of the things that I did was a piece of work a few years ago, and I've updated it, I think, last year, looking at the Global Compact, which has over 10,000 companies now signed up to the 10 principles behind it. There's always a worry of greenwash. And so there are a number of very key organizations. There's the Corporate Benchmarking on Human Rights, which was set up by the investors, some of the investors like Aviva. And the reason why they wanted to know that is they wanted to be able to know whether the companies that were claiming that they were doing human rights were actually doing it. And there's the benchmarking, the World Benchmarking Alliance, which deals with a number of SDGs, and they've absorbed or created a partnership with the Carbon Disclosure Project. And so they're looking at food, they're looking at gender, they're looking at carbon and a number of other areas, looking at internet access, I think. Anyway, so when looking at the Corporate Benchmarking on Human Rights, if you go to their website, you can look to see what companies are scoring against the Ruggie principles on human rights, the UN principles. And so the first year I did it, I would have guessed, if you had asked me based on my, in a sense, my understanding of the company, I would have expected Pepsi to have a very good human rights record because they had signed up to the principle that water was a basic human right. They scored 22% against it. And you can see the scoring that is done there on the Corporate Benchmarking Human Rights. The second year, they got something like 43 or 44%. So they clearly went back and looked at it. Coke got 40% the first year, I think 56% the second year. Starbucks has actually gone down. So their human rights record in the second report went down to 8.5%. And so it's very important that pressure is put on these companies when they're claiming to do stuff that's very good, and they may be doing environmental stuff, but they may be actually doing it against a set of human rights agreements. So it's very important. If you're US, I doubt if there are many US people on here today, don't go to Costco, don't go to Starbucks. I mean, if you're going to Starbucks, you're supporting potentially a company that's either not collecting the data or is scoring extremely badly on human rights issues. I think the next slide is yours, Jan-Gustav.
Yeah. Yes. We're going back again here to UNEP. Let me just also apologize, but my system suddenly crashed. And of course, being in a physical meeting where you are sitting addressing the audience, addressing a plenary, and you suddenly lose your voice, it is probably because the chair has found that you're speaking too long. And here there was a glitch in my system. I'm sorry about that. One of the questions often asked civil society or major groups or NGOs or non-state stakeholder is, what is your role in the future partnerships? And I have yet to listen to any of these non-state stakeholders come up with a very clear and succinct answer saying, our role in the partnerships to implement the SDGs or the program of work is this. In most cases, the organization will answer, will be a watchdog role, because that's what civil society, major groups, NGOs, and non-state stakeholders have been used to do for so many years. And what Felix just pointed to, using the Ruggie principles and look at the companies and their role in partnerships, is this watchdog role that we're used to do. When we're really angry as non-state stakeholders, we are prone to do shaming and blaming, which is an interesting part. But look at this. This is where we now try to pull together what we said yesterday and what we're saying today. It touches upon the program of work and the medium-term strategy, and it touches upon funding, and it touches upon maybe a set of new roles that the non-state stakeholders needs to have. I just read through this. It says, for implementation with partners to be relevant, important, and have lasting impact, another important issue, UNEP must prioritize and invest in internal knowledge management systems that allow for communication, lesson learning, and exchange of best practices. This will enhance the coherence of working with partners across UNEP. So, going back to all you participants and more people that will want to engage with UNEA 5, what will be your role in the implementation of the medium-term strategy and the program of work? Interesting question could be asked. Go back to your country and see, what is your country doing, because they just participated in UNEA 5. What is your country doing in trying to implement what they just agreed to, including the resolutions? Well, this is your watchdog role. But then the next question would be, what are the environmental and sustainable development issues in my country that relates to the program of work, that relates to the medium-term strategy, and how can my organization be privy to this and perhaps start implementing this? Can I have the next slide, please? Working with major groups and other stakeholders for external communication of UNEP's work, this is one thing. And I think this is something that we need to be aware of. So often we finish a UN conference with its exhilarating moments of meeting people who are like us, by meeting people who are not like us that we challenge, by having the useful information, by having the side events, by exchanging information. And after 2 hard weeks of work with very little sleep, and where adrenaline is the majority that keeps us awake the last 4 or 5 days, we say, Mike, thank you, it's over. And then we forget it. No, this is when you actually start to communicate UNEP's valuable work. You've been to the exam, you've taken the exam, we've passed the exam, now we start to work. Too often UNEP produces high quality and useful work that has not maximized this with an integrated communication strategy. Yes, to ensure wider impact. Now, you know, it's an intergovernmental organization. UNEP has to respect the framework in which it's operating. And one of the big issues is their sovereignty of the countries. How far can UNEP go with its all policy divisions to push countries into implementing this? Well, communication strategies should be drawn up and relevant partners identified at the programmatic concept stage. Early engagement. But this is another very important area where actually the non-state stakeholder can play a role. Emphasis should be placed on tailoring messages to relevant stakeholders, establishing partnership with educational institutions to access children and youth, utilizing the stakeholder engagement handbook, which exists and which is interesting read and good read and learning read. So we have a multiple set of obligations to be partners with UNEP. And to date, not many organizations have actually been in this role because of reasons that I could talk about, but I don't know if there's any substantive studies done on this. Could I have the next slide, please? Forming strategic partnership with major groups and stakeholders at sub-programmatic level, which form the overarching direction for projects and activities. Avoid fragmentation, enhance UNEP's impact. Strategic implementation partners should further contribute to policy and governance, experience and lesson learned. Narrowing the gap between these two groups will ensure policy better reflected lessons learned. All of these elements must come together in a partnership. And as we just talked about how to fund our organization. Well, LIDA emphasized a number of elements. Look at your funder, look at your own organization's priorities. And then I would say, if you're part of UNEP work, if you're participating in UNEA 5, and this UNEA 5 will decide on the program of work and the medium-term partnership, then see how you can be actually participating in implementation, in policy development, and use this as leverage to get funding. sensible timelines, sensible operative issues, and related to UNEP. Look at these elements that we have presented to you, because these are thoughts that you need to put in mind. Felix listed a number of qualitative elements to talk about criteria for developing a partnership. I think the reference here should be also how you develop a partnership and implement elements in the future. The information is available. I think the funders would be quite enamored by the fact that you are taking these into an operative position. And as a people organization, non-state stakeholder, you say that we are now engaged in a partnership with UNEP, and we will implement X, Y, and Z that comes out of the medium-term program, the program of work, and we contribute in this way to implement the SDGs within this decade of action. Next slide, please. The role of multi-stakeholder partnerships are many. UNEP adds significant value where it can play the role of convener in multi-stakeholder partnerships to help deliver the program of work, bringing a range of major groups and stakeholders around the table to discuss, exchange knowledge, develop initiatives critical for the success of UNEP's medium-term strategy and its program of work. You bring to the table, hopefully, in UNEA 5, and even at the CPR, we lobbied hard to open the CPR to participation from non-state stakeholder. And we managed to do that. This used to be a closed circuit meeting where civil society, NGOs, major groups, non-state stakeholders were not allowed. But a few years back, we were able to convince UNEP that we brought some substance to the table and that the CPR and the Bureau and also the plenaries of UNEP should listen to us. But then again, we have reiterated, Laida, Felix, and I, bring substance, bring your knowledge that is relevant. And if you sit down and look at your capacities and look at what you're doing today in an action-oriented decade, the question should be, what am I doing to instrumentalize and implement this? This is interesting information that you could bring to the table. Governments work on a government level. One of the fortes which is always brought into the discussion by civil society, by NGOs, by major groups, by non-state stakeholders is the contact we have with people at large. Well, if you do this on a serious basis, you also bring your constituency into your discussion, then you have something to give in terms of exchange of information and relevant experience. Next slide, please. Generating ownership, providing guidelines for working with different major groups. As far as possible, partnership with major groups should be of equal value to UNEP and to the external partner. Go back after UNEA 5 and look at the environmental challenges, the sustainable development challenges in your country or in your region, and see which of these elements are relevant to the medium-term strategy and the program of work that was just agreed to. And of course, UNEP should respond to this and fully utilize the stakeholder engagement handbook and working with partnerships. But why should UNEP engage if we do not bring anything substantive to the table? There is a mutual challenge here that is not always observed by my fellow non-state stakeholders. And this could be in addition to existing emerging guidelines on working with business, and this could be disseminated more widely. This is program in works, program that is being developed. And we can all participate in that and making substantive contributions, not the least in the upcoming UNEA 5. And next slide, please. This is an interesting quote. Kader Asmal chaired the World Commission on Dams, which was a very, very interesting commission and came up with a lot of interesting and very challenging findings, both to governments and to environmentalists and to organizations alike. He had to work with partnerships. You know, we're all interested and eager to be a partner with someone. But he said this: I have a parting warning. Doing so, I mean, conducting a multi-stakeholder partnership, is never a neat, organized, tidy concerto. More often, the process becomes a messy, loose-knit, exasperating, sprawling cacophony. Like pluralist democracy, it is the absolute worst form of consensus building, except for all the others. I find this quote very challenging, but you know, in this chaos, we need to make and find the methods, and this is possible with the common knowledge we have. But I would say this is one of the big challenges for the non-state stakeholder community today. We have been used to be the watchdog and the policy challenger. In the future, we need to do that as well as being implementers. And you should ask yourself, do I have the necessary capacity to be a contributing partner in a partnership under the, for instance, what we're talking about, the medium-term strategy and the program work. Felix, over to you. No, Felix, over to us. Question and answers, yes.
Thank you, Felix and Gustav, for that presentation on multi-stakeholder partnerships. I would like to now open the floor to questions. Again, I'll remind the attendees that you should put your questions in the Q&A box, please, not in the chat box. So if you have put some questions in the chat box, perhaps you can copy and paste them into the question box. And let's begin. Let me see what we have there. Okay. One question, do you know about emerging initiatives for ecosystem restoration decade or global framework on biodiversity? How could we input to make these initiatives more effective?
I could start by saying when there was an ecosystems appraisal carried out a few years back, the organizing partners within the UN system invited stakeholders to participate. And he went global, and one had the impression that hundreds of thousands of non-state stakeholder organizations could actually contribute and would do so. The number of participants from the non-state stakeholder arena was dismal. The response level was very low. Now, was that because they felt they didn't have anything to contribute? Was that because they felt that the system they were invited into was too complex? There was no such analysis done. But I have a feeling when I talked to a lot of the organizations that I thought would have been part of this assessment a while ago, they said, well, we do not know or understand the system's complexity, so we felt it would take too much energy to go into it. Well, that's one of the reasons why we do these training sessions, to explain the system for you. But I would say in general, be vigilant to the invitations that come, because they do come. And if you're an accredited organization with UNEP, you will see there are a number of invitations coming from Alexander Uras' Civil Society Office on a continual basis, year in and year out. Felix, you're muted.
I noticed something in the chat box about the intervention across, I think you mean SDGs, not MDGs. I mean, the difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, one of the critical ones, is the interlinkage between the goals and targets. And the Nexus conference that we did in 2014 played a significant role in getting interlinked targets in water and food. We didn't manage to get it in the energy section. And so, of course, there are interlinkage coalitions that one can create to enable one to address targets that are in more than one SDG. Just one other thing on the difference between the MDGs and the SDGs. The MDG 8, which was on partnerships, was actually only about partnerships between governments. And the difference between that and SDG 17 is what we're discussing now. It's partnerships among all of the stakeholders. So we have, over the last I guess, 15 years or whatever, learnt that it's not just governments that can implement these things. Often it's a coalition that can do it more effectively. And I would say that the other thing, in kind of, we're in this period as the MTS gets agreed, and then the program of work, where we're hoping that by doing these trainings that people become more aware of what's in the MTS. They may not want to engage in framing it. They just may want to know what the themes are and how UNEP is approaching it. But as it gets to the program of work, once you identify an area where you think you can have an impact on that program of work, or you think that the MTS should be doing a program of work on a particular area, then you can have a conversation with the relevant part of UNEP and start to work with them. Be proactive. Don't wait for them to engage. And I think that's been one of the problems. We have mostly ended up with advocacy stakeholders engaged with the UNEA process. There are stakeholders engaged with implementing the previous program of work, but that's, to be honest, mostly evolved through UNEP's reach out, and that tends to be the larger organizations, while it may very well be the smaller or medium-sized organizations in particular areas that could actually be much better for UNEP to be working with. But you need to be proactive. Look at the MTS, look at the areas that they're going for, then and work out which parts of UNEP are going to be leading on that, and start a conversation with them if you want to build a partnership, because it's really not about being given the stuff, it's about helping to design it.
How about another question?
Maybe I can add on that as well.
Oh, sure,
because I think it was not mentioned, but you also had a 10-year framework of programs on SCP, Sustainable Consumption Production. They also work with NGOs and civil society groups, I mean non-state actors. I have to admit that they also try to tend to work with the bigger ones and not the smaller ones. It was one of the complaints I have for many years. And then one small comment, but I think it's an important comment. There is another big difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, is that the SDGs are universal. So, and the MDGs was mostly focusing on the global south, while the SDGs are universal. So that means that all countries have to deliver on the SDGs, sustainable development. And I think mostly the global north should do most of the work on their environmental issues, of course, because they are the bigger polluters and the ones that are consuming most of the ecological footprint.
There's a question that I think I'll pose to each of the three of you and ask that you perhaps just give a quick one example answer if you have one. And the question is, and we'll start with Jan Gustav, what would you change about partnerships you have experienced to make their impact on sustainable development more positive?
This is a very important question, I think, and I've been talking and discussing this with the non-state stakeholder communities in my region and also elsewhere where I go. As Felix said, many of the organizations coming to UNEP, the non-state, are advocacy organizations, and they tend to sort of nourish that advocacy profile, and they tend to also come into the partnership discussions, and they keep doing the sort of the watchdog thing. In a partnership, to implement and being action oriented, you need to have capacity to understand what action and implementation means. The partnerships between private sector and the authorities of business, government and civil society and non-state stakeholders or major groups or NGOs, this non-state stakeholder group will lose ground to business, private sector, and governments if they do not engage in the implementation part. We must be advocacy, we must be watchdogs, but we must also understand the implementation level. Otherwise, we will be slowly squeezed out. And in the implementation level, getting people involved at a local level is extremely important, and it is possible. And this is the conduit, the bridge that we can, the non-state stakeholder can actually be. Thank you.
Felix, you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to have you need to build into the partnership clear objectives of what you're trying to do. And so if you are trying to address one or a number of the targets, then, what is your expectation of delivering that? How are you going to do it? And do you have a proper monitoring and review mechanism where you can start to publish what you're doing? I think too few of the partnerships, at least those listed on the UN website, have any system of knowledge management or anything. And I think it's not a mistake of the Secretariat because they haven't got a mandate to do it, but it's a mistake of the system because again, this is why Jan Gustav and I raised this back in 2014. We could see what was going to happen with the SDGs, which is that you need a part of the UN that's going to service and help those organizations. Some of it's even, basically a structure by which partnerships should be developed, a kind of capacity building toolkit that helps them develop partnerships based on the experience of others. And what we're not using is the Partnership Forum, which exists, it's a one-day event, or the HLPF to really force the partnerships to come and to report accurately on what they're doing and to have some type of peer group review. We've got a bit of peer group review on the voluntary national reviews, but we have no peer reviews on the partnerships. And I think there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done there. My suggestion for the Partnership Office in the UN, which is not the same as UN DESA, it's a separate part, was that they focused on a limited number of champions within the context of each of the SDGs, so that there could be at least some form of knowledge on how good partnerships like Gavi operate so that it can inform those that are starting up in a better way.
Thank you, Felix. Lida, what would you change about partnerships?
I don't know. I think most of the things are already said, of course. I'm a policy person. I'm very sorry, Jan Gustav, but my whole life is focused on advocacy work and defining the rules of the game. I think that's really important. I also don't see it necessary that all organizations that are in advocacy work are also doing the implementation. I think it is. I think it's as I said. It's also a profession doing advocacy, so you cannot do all. Which doesn't mean that the implementation and partnerships are important, of course, but it doesn't need to be done by the same organization. It can be done by others as well, so that they rely on the ones doing the advocacy and others rely on the others that do the implementation. I think on the partnerships, for me, I see a lot of partnerships which is just greenwashing or social washing or whatever, SDG washing. So I think the review and the monitoring is very, very important. And that was already said, of course. So I think partnerships are really interesting, but under criteria. And for me, advocacy personally is very, very important as well by defining the rules of the game.
Just to add to that, I've put in the chat box the link to the Earth Summit 2002 website of Stakeholder Forum. And in that, I've done it to the implementation conference. There's another one about the, I think it's called, I'll put it in later. Anyway, if you go down the different tabs, you'll be able to see how much work went into the launch of 23 Type 2 partnerships that SF went through. We spent a year helping partnerships meet, or people who were thinking of organizing partnerships to launch at Johannesburg. It's a huge time-consuming exercise, but there are lessons that can be learned, and that's what we did. And we ran what was known as the implementation conference at Johannesburg. As I say, we launched, I think, 23 Type 2 partnerships. About half of them survived, but we weren't, and this goes back to Jan Gustav's comment, we weren't funded to help them run it after Johannesburg. So there was no mechanism, no funding to allow us to be a kind of support mechanism for those partnerships that we had helped to birth. They were left for themselves to fail or to succeed. So, there needs to be much more, whether it's done by UN DESA or whether it's done by someone else or by UNEP, there needs to be a proper unit that's there to help support those partnerships. And again, hugely with LIDA on this, we've got to be, we can't have greenwash. There's no time for greenwash. These have to be serious partnerships that are going to deliver, and they have to be held accountable. And that's when we try to change the rules between 2014 and 2019 within the UN. And I did have a number of meetings with G77 and with developed countries. The people who stopped the holding of the partnerships accountable were the developed countries. It was Switzerland, it was Germany, it was the US. None of them wanted rules by which you would hold those accountable. Developing countries wanted rules because they wanted to know what's going on behind there. And so the problem has always been developed countries because they want to be able to do their own stuff and fund their own stuff and not be held accountable. So, yeah. I
want to just come in one thing and say, I do not disagree with what LIDA is saying. In fact, I agree. I'm also a policy person, and this is what I have been doing all my life. I don't mean for non-governmental organizations or non-state stakeholder working on the environment to start running bulldozers and I can't see us running around in hard hat. But what I said was we need to understand implementation. In my country, Norway, when you're doing bidding for a project, you have to list you have to put a number of sort of percentage on different elements: efficiency, implementation, money, etc. And then you come in the environmental element down there for how to implement road building and planning. Mm-hmm. And today, implement that environmental level of these procurement forms that private company has to fill out in order to do the bidding, that counts for 1 or 2%. Mm-hmm. And when, this is the kind of implementation you need to understand. Go in there and say, my goodness, there is something wrong with this format. Environment and sustainable development should count for 40%, because then you change the complete implementation process of the project itself when you do that. And that's what I mean. Mm-hmm. They understand implementation. And in that lies a heck of a lot of policy, because policy and implementation, as we both know, all three of us go together.
Go together, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just, we are running about a half an hour late, but I do want to ask this one question, which has come up in the question box. And I would like each of you to just think about it for a moment and answer yes or no, bearing in mind that it is your opinion. And we'll start with LIDA. And the question is, maybe partnerships should be part of the VNR. Yes or no?
No.
Felix? I think they're not mature enough to do that. There's no, already the VNRs are, we're still getting the governments to be held accountable to those. But maybe it's, maybe there's a separate report, and maybe it's produced by the multi-stakeholder councils or commissions that exist to produce a review of the partnerships in their country and do it as a separate report. I mean, we don't have councils in every country, but it would be a way of doing it. And maybe they have a role in, I know in Germany there is a partnership platform, but I think maybe Germany and Colombia is the only two that there's a partnership platform.
Jan Gustav, yes or no?
Yes and no. The time frame for HLPF today is too little, and as Felix said also, you need to put the partnership element in a context which makes sense within the VNR. This is part of the implementation, so I see there is a role for that, but it needs to be developed and thought through. And the accountability issue is very, very important.
Thank you. And
this opens a whole discussion also how this relates to monitoring and monitoring and the indicators. And the indicators also need to be discussed in relationship to the MTS and the program of works.
Well, thank you all for your inputs on that. Just as a reminder, we are meant to finish up in about 35 minutes, and we'll try to do that, bearing in mind that some of our participants might have other commitments to go to afterwards. So I'm now going to return the floor to Lida. I will reactivate the screen, and Lida, I'll let you take over with the Global Pact.
Yeah. As we are running out of time, I think it's better that we do the two modules or the two things at once, so that I do everything together. First, we start with the poll, because this is about the Global Pact for the Environment, and I would really like to know who is aware of the fact that it exists or it does not exist, and what your opinion is about. So Charles, can you give the poll? Do you see the poll?
Yeah, people are populating it, so yes, they do see it. It's been going for about 30 seconds. We're getting some good results. I'll let it go for a full minute before we stop. We've got about almost 50%. And at the moment, in the lead is I'm aware of the initiative to develop the Global Pact for the Environment, but not engaged.
Okay, that means that most of the people know that something is happening around a Global Pact for the Environment.
Yeah, and we're almost there, almost at a minute, and I'm going to stop it and I will share it. Lida, can you all see the shared results?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll save these and we'll share them with the audience. Thank you very much for that. And considering the amount of time that we have left, I'm going to stop with the sharing of the results, and we will now go back to Lida and the...
yeah. Okay, so next slide.
There we go.
Also for me it takes a while. Well, the slide is there, but I know what's on. So the Global Pact for the Environment, that was an initiative from the French President Macron. Well, it was not his initiative. It was his initiative to take it to the UN General Assembly. The initiative was by more than 100 environmental lawyers, experts, about 40 countries. They wrote a text, and that was called the Global Pact for the Environment. It was a list of many principles on how to really give rights to the environment and how to use the legal frameworks to protect the environment. One of the lawyers that was initiating this Global Pact was a personal friend of President Macron, and he convinced him to take that initiative to the General Assembly, and that was in May 2018. Next slide. So the General Assembly accepts the idea, I think in a moment that they were sleeping or not really aware that what they were accepting, because the Global Pact, the initiative, was quite provocative and revolutionary, I would say. Anyhow, so they accept the idea, and then they adopt the resolution 72/277. That meant that an establishment, which is often happening when a resolution is adopted, they establish an ad hoc open-ended working group to find out what member states and other experts, which was including the NGOs and the other major groups, what they think about it. And they draft a text and detect what is absolutely necessary. The two co-chairs were people from New York, because it was a process that started in the UN General Assembly, so it was still an ECOSOC process. So two people from New York, from Lebanon and from Portugal, they co-chaired 4 meetings. One in New York, and the other 3 were in Nairobi, because they found out, of course, that the environmental experts were in Nairobi and not in New York. That was a kind of strange situation. So we used the rooms in the conference, the venue in Nairobi, but UNEP was absolutely not involved, engaged. I mean, I think they were interested, they were sitting in the room, but they didn't say anything. I mean, they were absolutely not involved. That was, as I said, a strange situation. Who were involved were the NGOs. And some NGOs were very active on it, and we managed to find some funding to really mobilize the NGOs that were interested and engaged. And we had at the same time, I mean, we were part of those 4 meetings. We coordinated everything. I was one of the persons that facilitated the whole process for the major groups and stakeholders. Next one. I don't see the next one. Did you push the button already? Yeah. So altogether, I mean, member states, co-chairs, I think with a lot of input of the NGOs, they delivered a report and presented it to the General Assembly in 2019. It was identifying and assessing the possible gaps in the international environmental law, because of course everybody said, well, we have already a lot of international environmental law. The only thing is that just not enforced, which is a huge problem everywhere in the world. So the focus was, well, maybe we have to find out what are the gaps and how to really try to strengthen the existing environmental law and define and design new law that is covering the gaps. As I said, there was an active NGO participation. Also, some people that were part of that very original initiative. So lawyers, there were most of all of us were lawyers, not all, but most. So we were quite, I think, appropriate to do this work. They were also quite happy with us, I think, because we were really the ones that knew what was happening. Because for a lot of member states that were negotiating, or not negotiating because it wasn't an expert meeting, but let's say discussing, did not always have the background, the legal background for really discussing this issue. That was one of the frustration of the lawyers we had in our delegation, because it was really about the technical issues about the environmental law. Anyhow, the report was presented in 2019 and to the General Assembly. Next one. Again, the General Assembly adopts everything, the reports and the recommendations were endorsed, and they welcomed the work of that was done. That was adopted in the resolution that is now called 73333. We don't call it a Global Pact for the Environment anymore. It is now known, I mean, within the system, let's say, as resolution 73/333. It is entitled "Follow-up on the to the report of the ad hoc open-handed working group established, blah, blah, blah." So it is now what is, and that can you see in the next slide. So it was an UNGA process, so it was within the ECOSOC, it was a New York process. Now it is transferred to UNEA, because one of the things that is asked for in the resolution 73333 is to have a political and high-level political declaration later on this issue, and they're thinking of having that in Stockholm +50. We have now again substantive consultation meetings are Saklin Seya from Pakistan and Ado Lomus from Estonia. We already had the first consultation, the first consultation meeting that was done from 21 to 23 of July. That was a virtual meeting. Nevertheless, we also as NGOs, we could participate. We were quite active also again in the participation. And we also had a consultation meeting between us as major groups, mostly NGOs, farmers, indigenous people, women, they were all there. to kind of answer the questions of the co-chairs raised in their report as a kind of preparation for the consultative meeting. We also made a webinar already too. You can find them on the website of Stakeholder Forum. If you go to the Global Pact for the Environment, you see the recordings of the webinar. So there you will find much more information on what it is and what to do. But in summary, I think one of the demands of the NGOs, and I think that was accepted by the co-chairs and most of the member states, is that it's not only having a piece of paper with the let's say the principles for the environment. I mean, having the as it was in the initial paper and a list of principles to protect the environment, to give the environment rights. What we detected quite soon was that for a lot of developing countries, and not only for the developing countries, but maybe for all the countries, they don't have the resources, they don't have the knowledge of really dealing with environmental rights. We don't have a lot of environmental lawyers. So if there is a conflict on something where the environment is related, a lot of lawyers just don't know where to look, because also judges are not aware of it. So what is of course necessary as well is for the enforcement of the environmental law, what you need is also capacity building for judges, lawyers, officials, etc. So it has to go with a package, also funded, to really make the whole, let's say, the whole structure of the whole legal framework aware of the fact that environmental law exists. Next one. So what is now for UNEA 5 important? That is that United Nations Environmental Assembly has to prepare in its 5th session, that will be done in February, a political declaration for the United Nations high-level meeting. And that is then to be done I mean, that is, I think, more or less agreed that that will be done in Stockholm plus 50, so that will be in 2022. I was in the last CPR, and you already mentioned that there will be a second consultation meeting with the member states. And there again, as NGOs and stakeholders, we will prepare ourselves and have a meeting before that meeting and be part of the consultation meeting that will be in October, but we don't have the date yet. So we will hear that later. If you're interested, drop me an email so I can add you to the email list on the WhatsApp group that we're also using. I would propose, Charles, to go on with my next module so that we can have the question and answers on the end of the session. If not, I think a lot of people will lose this one.
Very good. We will do just that.
Okay, so next one. It is related, of course, to the Global Pact for the Environment. I mean, the Global Pact for the Environment was not something that just dropped out of the air. It's one of the things that you see more and more is that the focus on the environmental rights. I mean, also the link between human rights and environmental rights. We have, as human rights, we have the right to a healthy and safe environment. That is something that is there. You even see it in a lot of constitutions of nation states. I mean, everybody is talking about it, but I mean, the endorsement is again quite weak because it's not really understood what it means. The first person who already started to ask for rights for the environment, that was in 1962. That was Rachel Carson that wrote the book Silent Spring. I think we often come back to her. I think it's one of the most important books that started awareness raising on environment and environmental damage, and in this case also the rights for the environment. So in that case, it would be nice to have a really high level and visionary declaration on environmental rights in 2022, which will be then 60 years after Silent Spring book was published. As I said, there are many countries already that have environmental rights and things in their constitution. There is now also a memorandum of understanding between UNEP and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Secretary General also asked, I think, a few weeks or months ago, that we really need more attention. Of course, it had to do with COVID-19 as well. Have more attention for the human rights to have a safe and healthy environment. Next one. The human rights and the environment is something that is also put on the agenda within the UN system, because we have now already two special rapporteurs on human rights and environment. The first one, John Knox and David Boyd. They really did a great work. They also did not only do great work within the UN system, but they also wrote very good books. I really recommend you the book on the which is called The Environmental Rights Revolution. It's of course it's focusing quite a lot on the legal aspects, but it also shows you how important it is that environment has rights, and not only human rights. I mean, the human rights are quite human-centered, as the name says, but we have much more living species and nature, etc., on our planet, and of course they also have their rights. And I think it's a kind of new thinking. I mean, not that new, but I think it's something that is spreading out also because of, as I said, the COVID-19, that we see that we are damaging nature and ecosystems and animals and plants so much that it's explodes in our face if we don't really protect them, and protecting is not enough, it's really giving it rights as well. Next one. One of the things that is really interesting to use for NGOs and other major groups is the UPR, which is a Universal Periodic Review. It's a process that is happening within the Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner of Human Rights. It is every country will be reviewed, let's say, every 3-4 years. There is a whole cycle, so every country will have his turn. And the review is about if there are respecting human rights or not. So member states are writing their own reports. You have national focal points for human rights in every country. I mean, normally it is in every country, where they also write reports, and NGOs can also write reports on that. I'm working together with two environmental lawyers to do the experiment with making reports from the NGOs, where we really focus on environmental rights as a human rights, and bring that report to the High Commissioner of Human Rights and in part of the UPR. The first one was done in Holland, because my two colleagues, they live and work in Holland. And it was quite funny that there is a case in the north part of the Netherlands where a gas company is causing earthquakes because of the shale gas, etc. And they are not really. I mean, the government's not really taking care of the people living there, because their houses are damaged, etc., etc. Also because in this case, Holland was also not really having or not achieving the targets on climate, etc. So that was also one of the things, of the complaints of the NGOs, to bring to the human rights, to say that Holland is violating the human rights because they are not doing anything for the victims of those man-made earthquakes, and they are not doing enough for the climate change consequences. That was accepted. So Holland received a kind of reprimand to do something there, which is for press very interesting to know that that Holland is violating human rights, because normally the only thing that a lot of other countries violate human rights, but no countries in Europe. I mean, we're all really respecting all the human rights, which is of course not true. So that's why we really use the environmental rights in writing those reports. I did one with my colleagues in Paraguay. We are going to submit that report, that NGO report that was together with WWF, in October, to have that reviewed in May. Yesterday, we also started a process here in Belgium, where we also have some cases that you don't want to know about, and where you really see clearly that Belgium is also violating human rights, but of course with an environmental rights focus. And that, I think, is something new that NGOs and grassroots organizations could really use, because the Human Rights Council has more, let's say, legal opportunities to do, and a lot of things that are discussed in New York or in Nairobi. I won't say it's all voluntary, but it is, of course, has his impact as well, or should have his impact at least. But I think really using this as a strategy for your NGO to have your issues also brought in the human rights perspective, I think is a very interesting one. Next one. So, well, I already told you about the cases, the things that we did. So we did the Netherlands, Paraguay, and Tanzania is in progress. Belgium is also in progress. But let's say what is new on this is really that things, and that is not something that is very rare. I mean, land grabbing, deforestation, forest burnings in the forest, pollution of air, water, soil, etc. It's all something that you can really bring in the Human Rights Council as a violating of the human rights or environmental rights. And as you see in the tweets, we have our support of John Knox, which was at that time the special rapporteur for the environment. And I really hope that will spread out throughout the world, that apart from the voluntary reviews we have on the SDGs, we also have this kind of NGO reports that are important to make visible and known to the world. Thank you. That was it, I think.
Yes, Lida, thank you very much for those two presentations. I'm going to ask Jan-Gustaf and Felix to come back in. And what I'm going to suggest that perhaps you do, maybe the three of you can open up the Q&A box and take a look at what's in there, sort of maybe starting from the bottom and working your way up to see if there is something you might choose to address. We have 15 minutes to do that and to wrap up. So maybe each of you, if you see something you want to jump in on, if you would do so, and then we'll go from there.
Looking at the bottom one, I mean, I think, if I was planning Stockholm Plus 50, I'd be looking to have events in as many cities and towns across the globe as we could for people who couldn't get to Stockholm. And with the right design of input, that's a possible thing to do, because it would then raise the profile of Stockholm Plus 50 in all cities, as opposed to just where people are attending in Stockholm.
Can I just, there's a question that's been put in twice that I'm going to just go and look at. And basically, the original question was, you have been stressing, I suppose I don't know if it meant SG12, do you mean SDG12, a few times yesterday and today. Are we understanding that you are telling us to get guidance from that? So have you all been having a somewhat indirect focus on the stakeholders to look for some guidance from SDG12? Anyone can start with that.
Well, one of the reasons why it's come up is that in the 2012 Rio outcome document, The Future We Want, in the paragraphs after 87, 88, 89, where they specifically referred to the UN Environment Assembly being established, they also say that SDG 12, they don't say SDG 12 back in 2012 because we didn't have the SDGs until in 2015, but they say that SCP issues, standard production and consumption, is the mandate of UNEP. So it's natural also to refer to that a couple of times. I also know that from recent discussions with the organizers and the Ministry of Environment in Stockholm that they want to focus on the SDG 12, seeing that consumption production issue is something that relates to a very large extent to the so-called developed world. But I think we also should be mindful that consumption is going up almost everywhere. But it is the mandate of UNEP to deal with that. You know, they have had an office in Paris for a long, long time, which has been the sort of focal issue of that. I know this SCP issue is also something that Lyda can talk a lot about.
Yeah, no, I think it is, I mean, when we talk about environmental rights, if we talk about the Global Pact for the Environment, etc., it goes beyond SCP. Right. SCP, as you know, I'm very happy that we have that in the program, etc., but it's a very, let's say, economic issue. I mean, it's mostly about that. It's about, okay, we have the economy, we have production, consumption, and how are we going to make it as sustainable as possible and fair, etc. If you talk about environmental rights, it's really giving rights to others than humans. So I think that goes beyond the economic discourse that we have within the SCP discussions. So I really think that, of course, everything is related, but I will also relate it to the other SDGs, with this land on water, underwater land, or really, yeah, let's say, I would not mix that up too much.
I just wanted to come in. There's a conversation. There's things from Malik on should UNEA 5 be online, like the Oslo Forum, to reduce carbon footprints for aviation fuel. The answer is no. And I think I would probably speak for the three of us when we say that you cannot do negotiations online. It will definitely exclude stakeholders, and it will mean very little chance to advance issues, because the government's hierarchy will control what those government officials are allowed to do, and they'll be more monitored. When you're at UNEA, you're able to influence the government officials away from the governments themselves. So it would be an utter disaster for any negotiation to be online. There are events that can be online. I mean, actually the HLPF can be online. There's no reason why it's not a negotiating forum. I'm not suggesting that it's the best way of doing it, but what clearly happened with the HLPF is a larger number of people participated in it than have done if it's in person. So there may be an argument for hybrid versions of this, but definitely not for negotiations.
No, I would second that. I know that lots of organizations and people react to what I'm going to say, but I still want to say it, and I think it needs to be said. When you look at the carbon dioxide emissions as per industry in the world, civil and military aviation accounts for 2.7%, while buildings account for more than 40%, and land-based transportation account for between 22 and 25%. So the focus that media often has on the airline industry being grounded and thus decreasing the overall emission of carbon dioxide is not completely correct. It is an additional issue, but it's not completely correct. So you know, when we talk about carbon emissions and the need to save the planet from global warming, which is a hugely important issue, let's get our facts right as well. And I think what Felix says, the difference between the HLPF and UNEA is that HLPF has a very small element of negotiations, and that is the ministerial declaration or the political declaration coming out of it, whereas UNEA is a negotiating process from almost from the start until the end. So this is very important to have that. But I want to go back to what Lyda talked about, the environmental rights issue, and also the reference to the book which actually awoke me to the environmental process, Rachel Carson's mind-boggling book from 1962. Maybe there needs to be an understanding from lawyers all over the world to see that there is an expansion of justice. And there's another fascinating book on legal matters internationally, written by an eminent professor of law systems called Dorothy Jones. And she wrote a book in the early 90s called Towards a Just World. And she says that there are areas linked to justice in international affairs. And she refers to peace, rights, and law. So justice for peace, justice and rights, justice and law. And then I found an interesting follow-up article later, not written by Dorothy Jones, but referring to this and say, and today, justice is connected closely to environment and environmental law. So this is something that is of huge importance. And I find also a number of reluctance among lawyers, traditional lawyers, to deal with this issue because they are unaware of and they are unaccustomed to discussing these things. Sometimes I find it because it lacks the necessary understanding of the environmental rights. And when they ask me to give them information, I said, well, go to the panel on biodiversity and look at the IPBES reports, and you see the need why we have the need for environmental rights there.
Thank you. I'd like to.
I think it's also, I mean, it's the same, I think, with the discussion on economic growth and our economic model. I mean, if you talk that with the traditional economists, they also don't want to talk about it. But I think it's a growing group, an increasing group of economists that really see that our economic system is wrong. I think it's the same happening with environmental rights. I think more and more people see that you need to have some law about what to do with damaging the environment. I mean, most of the corporations are totally free in damaging the environment. I mean, they are not held accountable for that. So I think there is a lot of terrain to still to develop and to win.
I'd like to make a quick statement about one of the issues earlier and then pose one more question. I've noticed there's some more statements about carbon outputs and so on. The interesting fact here in the New York metropolitan area, 40% of the output is from transportation because over the years, building have become more efficient. The populations have been more densely in large buildings. For instance, New York City, large high-rises apartment buildings, the actual efficiency in terms of electricity is quite high because of the concentration. So it varies so much from different parts of the world in terms of the actual impact of the various streams of outputs. Now, back to questions. This is one for Lyda. Is the Universal Periodic Review report confidential or transparent?
Well, the NGO reports are transparent, and I think the member state reports as well. I don't think that the negotiation, or not negotiation, but the discussion they have is maybe behind closed doors, but I mean, the outcomes are all open. So you can see if a member state sent in a report and then the recommendation that they have towards the country, that's all open. But maybe if I know he cannot speak, but I know he's there, and he's more expert, I think, on the UPR itself than I am. But I think it's mostly open. But maybe if you can put it in the chat box.
Thank you all very much. We have about 5 minutes left, and we don't have any more questions. So I would ask if each of you would like to make some closing statements. Lyda, I'd be happy for you to begin with that.
No, I think it was nice again to have this capacity building and having another audience than we had last week, which was mostly Asian NGOs. I think every region is quite different also in raising the questions, etc. I think again that it's important to disseminate your knowledge and even the PowerPoint that we are presenting and maybe the recording afterwards to your constituency, so that it's really going widespread, that it's that everybody knows about it. And I only can say that we will have in October, November, a next one, which will be done in Spanish for the Latin American region.
Thank you. Ida, Felix, some last
Yeah,
comments?
I wanted to just kind of come in a little bit on the air fuel stuff, because I realize it's an important issue for a lot of NGOs. And though it's about 3.5%, it's increasing depending on the reduction of CO2 emissions from other things, and the original expansion of air travel that was planned, which of course hasn't happened because of the COVID-19 decision, the COVID-19 pandemic. What you have seen is that the IATA, which is the agency that kind of deals with this within the UN family, the commitment of the airlines towards the goal that they had has slipped back, and they've made statements on that. So be aware of that. Now, and number two, transport is one of the issues on the COP agenda for Glasgow, and so there are processes going on, and I've forgotten what the coalition is called, but there is a coalition that's been set up to deal with jet fuel. British Airways and Shell have a pilot scheme which has got slowed down, but it's now back on, where they will take household waste and convert it to air fuel, which will reduce the carbon intensity by 70%, and they're planning to trial that out at London Airport, is my understanding. And that's a way of massively, in the short term, moving that. And my understanding is you don't have to change the engines much, so it can be with existing fleets. The Dutch are developing some real interesting work on synthetic fuels, which is the medium to long term issue in the context of addressing that. So it is a live issue, and it is one which a lot of people have looked at as something that you need to do. And I have to say, I do think that we've ended up through this process of learning that we do not have to go to so many meetings that we thought to, that actually some of them can be much better if it's done online and we get to more people. So I think we all need to look at whether or not those journeys that we're taking are needed. And I think you're going to see a reduction of travel accordingly.
Thank you, Felix. Jan Gustav, some final words from you, please.
Yes, I can only say that I second what's been said by my two colleagues here. I just want to add one more thing, and tying this whole thing together, as a capacity building and information dissemination process on UNEA 5. There will be a number of meetings that are linked directly to the thematic development, which will be part of the agenda in February next year under UNEA 5. There is a meeting in October 6th, and I believe October 6th and 7th by the CPR, where they will be developing sort of the final touches on the medium-term strategy. There will be another few meetings as we come into the later part of this autumn. We meaning Stakeholder Forum, will be tracking these meetings, and we will be putting this into a report, a guide on thematic development between now and UNEA 5. This will be published and uploaded in as many languages as we can get money for. The last one we did was uploaded just prior to the Oslo meeting. And as I said earlier, that was done in English, French, Spanish, and Russian. And we're trying to also get money for the remaining two languages, for Chinese and Arabic, and to do that. So this guide will be produced towards the end of October, beginning of November, uploaded on the website of Stakeholder Forum, and will give all the participants here and the other one that we will do consultations with, and also everyone else who wants to access this, an understanding of what will be the focal points of the thematic focal points during the UNEA 5 negotiations, all in the spirit of trying to prepare the non-state stakeholders for what's going to be an important meeting in February. Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, Gustav, thank you so very much. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and to the Civil Society Unit at the United Nations Environment Program for their cooperation and contributions. And a big thank you to Jan Gustav, Felix, and Lida for delivering today's rich content.